The Legend of Zelda video game franchise is beloved worldwide for its intricate and entertaining dungeons. And for many other reasons. But on this channel, we mostly talk about how to make tabletop games with dungeons more fun. And now that our Lord and Savior, Matthew Mercer, is voicing the villain in a Legend of Zelda game,
rise, my servants, sweep over Hyrule.
It's about time we talk about the Temple of Time. But not specifically, or any specific Zelda dungeon, just the overarching themes and the underlying dungeon design principles that characterize a Zelda dungeon, and how we can translate those ideas into our tabletop role-playing games. Because I'm Bob, this is where we learn how to have more fun playing RPGs together, and the easiest way to give your dungeon a little Zelda flavor is just by using the music. I can't actually play a Zelda song here because YouTube rules, but I might be able to get away with this. Even without whole songs, just using those delightful sound cues whenever your character opens a chest, discovers an item, or solves a puzzle helps to gamify the dungeon in a way that evokes a Legend of Zelda aesthetic. So without even thinking about the dungeon's layout or the methods the party must use to proceed through the dungeon, all that stuff we're going to talk about for most of the video, if your players can recognize Zelda music, use that to your advantage. I think many of us underestimate the sheer weight carried by music in determining what we feel during the shows and movies we watch and the games we play. And in tabletop RPGs, where most of the game happens in our collective imagination, playing music is a simple way to anchor the player's experience. Now, if your players can't recognize Zelda songs, or you just want to quickly throw together a playlist and not worry about YouTube ad breaks, see where I'm going with this? You can check out this video's sponsor, the Describe Sonic Library. I even made a tutorial with them showing how easy it is to search and save their music, atmospheric ambience, and sound effects from the Sonic library of over 2,000 professionally composed tracks. That tutorial also covers how to easily stream that audio directly to your online game group using Describe's very own web player with higher audio quality than other popular audio streaming platforms. Check it out through the link below or sign up with code BOB to save 10%. Similar to music, another atmospheric quality of Zelda dungeons is how strongly they adhere to a given theme. I will never forget the dungeon that takes place within the body of a giant fish, and that's one you should probably use in your tabletop game too. The thing is, Zelda games tend to have a more storybook fantasy quality where it's okay to have your all-out water-themed fish dungeon within kinda easy walking distance of your all-out fire-themed lava dungeon. Whereas in games like D&D, we often save these dungeons with overbearing themes for planes of existence that your party may not reach until higher levels, or at least for climactic sessions at the end of an adventure. So the simple suggestion here is to not save the good stuff for later. Lean heavily onto themes in your dungeons and into that storybook style fantasy, where just over the hill lives a titanic giant who can plop your party into the cloud castle in the sky, or where every fisherman knows the lake fairy lives at the bottom of the lake, and if you can find a way to get down there, she'll give you a magic sword. And then it turns out that you need that specific magic sword to fight the bad guy in the sky castle, because aside from atmospheric elements like music and themes, Zelda adventures and dungeons are almost exclusively fetch quests. Retrieve the thing, or defeat that monster to claim the thing, or save that person so they'll give you the thing. And you always need the thing to proceed to the next stage of the adventure. This is where we get to the principles behind the layout of a dungeon. All game dungeons can be categorized as linear, where a character must proceed through a dungeon on a predetermined course, or nonlinear, where a character can freely determine their own course through it, or somewhere in between. But what makes Zelda dungeons special is the second major dungeon categorization, puzzle box or lock-and key dungeons versus the all-too-common gauntlet-style dungeon. For example, most dungeons in Skyrim are fun, but they're usually quite linear, having few short branching paths, and they're usually gauntlets, loaded with enemies to sneakily shoot with your bow before they even know you were there. Yes, with an occasional image-matching puzzle game. Now, I haven't played every installation in the Zelda franchise, but I think it's safe to say that most of their dungeons are also linear. It's still a video game, and most of the time you must follow a strict procedure to unlock new areas. The Zelda trick, however, is that rather than filling each area only with a bunch of monsters to kill, Zelda dungeon areas often contain keys, items or information that get the character to circle back through previous explored areas, sometimes transforming those areas in the process. The simplest example of this is a dungeon where the character passes by a locked door in one area, and then later in another area, they find a key, which gets them to go back to that area with the locked door. Most dungeon puzzles, even Zelda puzzles, are just abstractions of this procedure. In fact, that was exactly how most of the puzzles worked in the original 2D Zelda games, as I understand it, but it wasn't until 3D came along with Ocarina of Time that dungeon puzzles seemed to explode in complexity. And I am a 90s kid, so that's the one I know. This complexity, however, is the biggest obstacle in running a Zelda-style dungeon in a tabletop game, because the players do not have a three-dimensional visualization of the dungeon. Maybe that's something the D&D VTT will actually be useful for, but for 90% of tabletop game masters out there, we're using two-dimensional overhead maps, maybe a few terrain pieces, or theater of mind with no visual aids at all. So unless you and your players have exceptional memory, spatial reasoning, and communication of distances and dimension, a genuine 3D Zelda dungeon would be incredibly frustrating at the table, especially when your party realizes that all they had to do was push a boulder onto a pressure plate to unlock the door 3 areas away. I joke, but that level of simplicity is actually what I think we should aim for with Zelda puzzles in tabletop games. Except, when your PCs move the boulder onto the pressure plate, you don't describe a short cutscene where the camera flies to show you that a door opened elsewhere, you just need to provide some cues. It could be something simple like, you hear a loud thud beneath the boulder, then a click, then the distant sound of heavy stone scraping on stone for just a few seconds. Or it could be something even more simple, like... That was the Zelda puzzle solving sound. Hopefully YouTube lets me use that. And if you like these audio cues, give this video a thumbs up and let me know in the comments if you have any other ideas for describing or indicating when something happens off screen, away from the party. So in-game, your puzzle's key can be anything. A pressure plate, a lever, a large gem that you have to shoot with an arrow, or an actual key, but they should be relatively obvious, and so should the locks. A platform raised a few feet above the ground on a corkscrew-shaped pillar. A chasm with a series of doorways on either side and one bridge that rests in a track along the chasm. A room half filled with water that has giant pipes and valves in the ceiling and the floor. Anything mechanical should work very well as an obvious visual cue, but if you're playing a fantasy game, you also want a lot of your puzzles to rely on magic. You just need to make sure there's some obvious sign that magic is part of the solution. In all my games, strange runes is the signal for that. But perhaps the most important factor that will really drive home this Zelda style in a puzzle dungeon is when opening or activating one lock simultaneously closes another, or if your open lock has multiple states of activation, or even automatically resets itself. For example, every time a character shoots the gem in one room, the water level in another rises 10 feet, blocking some doorways, but now reaching new doors on higher platforms. After it hits the top, it drains 10 feet every time they shoot the gem. Or, when they shoot the gem, the water level rises to the top and falls back to where it started, all in 1 minute. So the party needs to make some decisions about who is shooting, who is swimming, and who is running back and forth between communicating what the heck is going on. So the placement of those keys and locks is critical, but it is mostly conceptual in terms of your dungeon design. Typically, you just want at least one area between each key and its respective lock. They can be in the same room, and after you run 1 or 2 of these dungeons, your players might be really suspicious if it seems too easy to solve a puzzle. But the further away you place each key from its lock, the harder it is for your players to remember the layout and where the key needs to go or what it activates. As for the physical layout of a puzzle-based dungeon, Zelda dungeons often have a central room with branches, or some hub that is not necessarily in the center, but is nonetheless the main area that the character must frequently return to in order to reach other areas. From our previous example, the hub would probably be the room with the rising and falling water. This tall water room could reach vertically through multiple dungeon levels like an elevator shaft. Then, a lower level of the dungeon could have a branch, with a room with the gem that the party shoots to raise the water in the hub room. And a higher level of the dungeon has a branch with a room with the gem that the party shoots to lower the level. Or maybe that's already too complex. But whether or not it is too complex depends entirely on how much you show your players. If you prepared maps for each level of the dungeon and reveal it as they explore, you're probably good. But for Theater of Mind, that example could be tough unless you have a dedicated mapping player, or alternatively, you just hand-wave navigation after they've discovered those rooms. And of course, for any good Zelda dungeon, the party ultimately needs to find one abnormally large key that opens a big door to a big symmetrical room with a giant monster that has one huge eye, which they must strike 3 times to proceed through each stage of the battle, defeat it, and ultimately retrieve the thing from the chest. If you liked any of these ideas, remember to give this video a thumbs up and share it with a friend so more people will see it. Then watch this video on your screen about how to make a random encounter table for your dungeon. Thanks to the Bob World Builder patrons for making all of this possible. Thank you for your support, and keep building.